Hello and welcome to Prairie Pulse. Coming up later in the show, we'll meet Jim Ulmer from Frazee, Minnesota. But first, Matt O'Lean had a chance to sit down with our guest for this week.
And my guest on Prairie Pulse is Bruce Jovig, the co-author of Innovative Entrepreneurs of North Dakota and Northwest Minnesota, 150 Years of Impact. Bruce, welcome to the show.
Glad to be here.
Good to see you again. I ran into you in the old UND days when I was a student up there, and you've been there a long time and doing great work. So thank you for coming on the show.
Glad to be here.
Tell us first about your background, Bruce. Where you're from originally.
Originally, I'm from Crosby, up in the
Okay.
very northwest corner, north of Williston, right on that corner. The farm was 3 miles from Canada, 22 miles from Montana. And then I went to the University of North Dakota, and I actually was a science major, majoring in zoology, mathematics, and chemistry, triple major.
And
So-
you kind of made your career at UND, right? Tell us about that.
I did. Other than a few years outside, yes. But I started then, went back for fundraising, working with Earl Strinden, and then in 1984 started the Center for Innovation and launched it, which was one of the first 4 entrepreneur outreach centers in the country.
Yeah. I'll ask you about that later because you're now CEO Emeritus of the center, right? So you and Hiram Drake, a well-known person in this area, co-wrote this book. Tell us about Hiram's contributions to the book and how you guys happened onto this project.
Hiram has been a longtime friend of mine. As we got together, as I used him quite often as an expert on some of the entrepreneur questions dealing with agriculture, because he is an ag entrepreneur expert, an agricultural innovation expert. And we started talking 4 or 5 years ago about doing a book together with ag entrepreneurs and other entrepreneurs of the state. And I have been collecting entrepreneur stories for 30, 40 years as we did the North Dakota Entrepreneur Hall of Fame and the North Dakota Business Innovator of the Year Awards, annual awards. And we thought that story should be captured. So after talking about it for a couple of years, we finally sat down and decided to do it. And that was shortly after I retired in 2017.
Lots of research, right?
Lots of
having
research.
to pin down who to focus on in this book. I'm sure Hiram was a big help with his background in that. And
Absolutely. And of course, he did some of the research and some of the, like Norm Jones, Ron Offit. He knew that story as well as anybody, so he could bring that together. So there was quite a few where he had done the research, and then there was another 40 or so where I had already done some of the research. Then we had to complete the research.
yeah, tell me about that. So again, you knew some of these people, but if you're going to write a book, you really got to nail it down.
You got to nail down, and over 150 years, obviously not everybody was alive. So we had a lot of folks from the 100 years ago, 75 years ago, that we had to really, go to the newspapers, go to books, wherever we could to get information. And others, we were able to go to the family and get information. And towards the end of the book, as it comes to, of course, then I got to do primary research, and we got to talk to the folks and interview them and so forth. So it's a process, and it's different whether it was more recent or some time ago.
Yeah. How do you co-write a book with someone? I mean, did Hiram do one chapter? You do another person?
We
Do you
split it up.
coordinate? Okay.
Those of which he knew he did. I agreed to do all the research,
Okay.
where he hadn't already done it. So that was a part of it. Then what he did is he wrote, and it's actually to write small chapters. There's 5 or 6 pages per each one of these. There's 64 chapters, 64 different entrepreneur families being profiled. So it is, none of us co-authored a chapter.
Right.
It's one chapter or the other. And he did about a third, and I did about 2/3 of the chapters in the book. And then, of course, it's the editing process. But I did anywhere he hadn't done the research, I agreed to do all the research. He did some of the writing, I did some of the writing.
Okay. So lots of people profiled. Some of the names we all know, Gary Theraldson and people like this. But tell me about how you picked, who you picked, and maybe some of your favorites. Who are some of your favorites?
That's a good question, because for a while we had as many as 200 names to choose from that we threw out as possibilities. And then we decided we didn't want the book to be more than 300 pages, so we had to get it down to what it was, 64. And actually, when I say that, our goal was 50 to 60, and we still went over, right? But it is, and because we really said, and the innovative factor was a part of it that really weeded some up, because we wanted them to both be innovative and an entrepreneur. They had to have both factors. They did something that was unique, different, that really set them aside from somebody else. So it couldn't be a business that replicated something else. There was something unique here, and then they were a good entrepreneur as well.
And who are some of your favorites?
Well, certainly Jay Schuler, just because I know him so well for doing Giant Seeds. And his whole story of getting also that he is the son of an entrepreneur and he's the father of 2 entrepreneurs. And watching that sort of develop as he went through 16 different companies. I mean, that's a real serial entrepreneur. And, we mostly know him from Seeds 2000 and from Giant Seeds, but he has got a lot of other companies besides that. And, 2 of them were failures. 14 of them made money. And so that was really sort of an exciting. So certainly Jay, just because how many people do you know start up 16 companies in a career of 30-some years?
Yeah. How about some others that you liked writing about and researching?
Well, certainly Gary Tharaldson's story was terrific, right? I mean, because it's a school teacher becoming an entrepreneur and really dominating and really becoming North Dakota's probably most successful financially of all the entrepreneurs. Certainly Doug Burgum would be in that category. What he did with Great Plains Software and sending it to Microsoft that's a great high-tech story. And you certainly, even the Dalrymple story of 2 generations there, the Dalrymple Farms, which is the largest of 91 bonanza farms in the state, and really one of the most successful. And of course, then Jack also being so successful with the pasta company in Carrington, but then also his political career and what that all meant. And he had his hand in lots of other startups as well.
Yeah. Now, we've had Gary on this show, and you mentioned Jay with some failed businesses. This seems to be a theme that I've discovered. Not everybody hits it out of the park on the first try. Failure is a great motivator, isn't it, Bruce?
It really is. And, and it's not failure if you learn from it. And, and they all picked some they learned some lessons from that challenge, and they learned the importance of persistence and picking yourself back up again and to have another opportunity. And some of them, if you look at also the failures, by the way, if you start a company in the wrong cycle in the market, no matter how good of an idea it is, it still can fail. Yeah. Because of cash flow and market forces and all sorts of things that really impact the business. And some of them are that factor as well. Other times, people find opportunity in those market cycles.
Right. That led me to a question I did not have ahead of time, and that is COVID. So you mentioned the right time for businesses. I've had 2 people now tell me this is actually might be a decent time to start a business depending on the business. What do you think during COVID? Where are some opportunities, do you think?
Wherever there's a major disruption, there's people get hurt, and that disruption creates opportunities for others. So it is, and any time there's disruption in the market, it creates opportunity. So recessions, depressions, things like COVID, rapid change, all of them, for somebody, it's an opportunity because the market has changed and the marketplace has changed. And so like with COVID, certainly you think of the biotech center, it's a huge opportunity for the biotech industry. Huge. Yeah. And we're going to talk, Aldevron certainly and Fargo here they're a big player in that change. But it also, for example, is not a good time to be in the travel business or entertainment or or the airline or hotel industry. But the other side of that is for personal safety equipment. It's a great time for that kind of market. And obviously, if you're into web marketing, because so much right now is moving to the web for marketing and sales of products and technology, even services. So that disruption is creating an opportunity for someone.
And we might know in a couple of years who really took advantage of this.
Who took advantage of it, yeah.
Right. Can you read a passage from the book, Bruce?
Sure. One of my great stories is cream of wheat, because everybody can relate to that. In the 1880s and 1890s, there was 3 companies that went public out of Grand Forks: Nash Finch, C.H. Robinson, and Cream of Wheat. And Cream of Wheat is one of those stories that we just talked about that really came out of the Depression of 1893. They started a flour mill in 1890. In 1893, the world turned upside down as a major crash. And they were making flour, and they were sending it to the East Coast, to New York in particular. And all of a sudden, their markets were disappearing. They had put $100,000 into the company in 1890. They tried to sell it for $5,000 in 1893 in that crash. Couldn't even, they couldn't sell it for the whole company for $5,000. So the bankers who had banking money had to actually put money into the stock. And then they sent, some boxcars. Their miller was taking out of the wheat, taking the middlings, which is the germ part of the wheat, and making a white porridge out of it, hot breakfast porridge. They thought they had nothing to lose, so they sent some cases of cream of wheat to their broker in New York who was selling their flour. And this is how quickly a business can pivot. And now they had just sent a boxcar of flour, and in it they had these new boxes of cream of wheat, which they come up with that name because it's the creamiest part, the best part of the wheat, and sent it forward. Within 12 hours after the car arrived at Lamont and Corliss, they telegrammed back requesting 50 more cases of cream of wheat. The next day, another telegram was even more encouraging. Never mind shipping us your flour, send us a carload of cream of wheat. As of October 6, 1893, they were no longer in the flour milling, they were in the hot cereal business.
Just like that.
Yeah, just like that.
Wow, that's amazing. Let's talk about some other success stories people are familiar with. American Crystal Sugar. How did that get started?
Well, it's very interesting because that was a long germination period, a long pregnancy, so to speak, because Earl Babcock was an engineering professor at UND, and he was one of those guys. He was out there. He started the coal mining industry in North Dakota and the mining of clay. But then he got talking about crops and how to diversify, because wheat was starting to deplete the soil in North Dakota. Too much of it was being grown on too many rotation years. So he started looking for, and this was too far north to grow corn, which was very popular in southern Minnesota and Iowa as a diversification rotation crop. So he started doing field trials on sugar beets, and he got that clue from the Germans. We're doing that. So he started working with the farmers and doing field trials and found out this was superior soil and weather for growing beets. They were getting great tonnage per acre and a great percentage of sugar content. And so he really pushed that from the 1890s, and then the Chamber of Commerce of Grand Forks really got behind him and with the farmers. And they basically went to American Crystal Sugar out of Denver, which was owned by the Oxnard family, and convinced them to build, in Grand Forks. They didn't want to build, so they actually went and bought a abandoned sugar beet found out of California and moved it to East Grand Forks. And that started the sugar beet industry in Grand Forks, and that took till 1926. So we started doing those field trials in 1890. The Chamber of Commerce got on in some place, I don't remember the exact year, it's in the book, but let's say in the mid, roughly 1915. And it took till 1926 until actually the plant was bought. Now they were growing sugar beets at this time, but sending them south into southern Minnesota to be processed, which means there wasn't a lot of profit at that point. They needed to bring the processing up here to be profitable. And then there wasn't another sugar beet plant built after 1926 until after World War II, and then 4 more were built, which became now, over $1 billion industry in the Red River Valley.
Yeah, Hillsboro, all the plants, yeah.
Hillsboro, Drayton, exactly.
Yeah. How about Melrose? That's a huge one.
Huge one. 3-generation family of the Melrose and Dahls. And of course, as E.G. Melrose started, he was just one of those inventive farmers that was just terrific down by Gwinner. Really, first of all, he did one of the first early tractors, and then he started doing, swathing equipment, harvesting equipment. And really that's, he just really did a super job. And the, I can't think of the name all of a sudden, the rake. But, it was, but it just a great manufacturing friend, brought his sons in, brought Gene Dahl, his son-in-law, into the company. And of course, they just found new opportunities as they met then also with the, and doing the Melrose Bobcat, and bringing that in, which really was to clean turkey barns, but now it's mostly known for construction. Right. And then, of course, selling it so it could grow. And then the family, Gene Dahl and his family, they put the money back in, and then they become, went to the Steiger family up in Red Lake Falls and did Steiger Tractor. So, you think they were the first major prairie industrialists. The biggest manufacturers out here in the prairies was started because of E.G. Melrose and their family. So it's a very important story. And just think about just the Steiger Tractor. Gene Dahl was a wonderful friend and advocate for the Center for Innovation. But one time we sat down and he said that he had traced 35 companies that had started because of the Steiger four-wheel tractor. So not only was he an entrepreneur, he allowed 35 other folks to be entrepreneurs, making equipment for the Steiger tractor and be a supplier, a vendor, follow-on equipment, whatever the case may be. But there was 35 companies that were created because of the Steiger tractor.
Right. Now, let's talk about some newer entrepreneurs, Carrie Warburg Block, who we've profiled here at Prairie Public, and Michael Chambers. Tell us about those two.
Well, Carrie was very interesting. Her father was an entrepreneur. He was, a gas station entrepreneur out in Williston, North Dakota. And he was also, by education, he was worked with insects and pest control and so forth. And so as a little girl traveling, and her father was her inspiration, she started making stuff. And this whole idea of, of getting rid of mice by natural ways, not using traps, she started when she had married a farmer from Newtown and found out the mice problem on the farm. And so, and she was determined to find a way to repel mice, and thinking about, now mice don't like smell. No, they smell. They're very sensitive to smell. And these smells, and she had used, when a mouse ran up her leg one time, she grabbed the perfume thing and sprayed it, and they ran away, and a couple others also ran out of the cab when she was starting, and I gave her the idea of this natural repellent. And so she is a major entrepreneur in developing a whole new category.
Yeah.
And that's what's really sort of fascinating, right? Because before then, you think pest control, like mouse control, was all based on either traps or killing or poisoning, right? And here she had a whole nother way and created a whole new category, and really developing it over time. And then, of course, finding out the challenges of the FDA. That was a major challenge. And they told her she could spend, 5 years and $2 million, which she had neither 5 years or $2 million. And she found to cut that way down and got some grants to do it, got at the FDA approval for, a chemical-free way to repel mice instead of kill mice. Yep. So, just a great innovation.
And Michael Chambers.
I met Michael actually as a student. He came up to the Center for Innovation up there when he was an NDSU student, and I worked with him to help start the company with John Ballantyne, and as they went through the whole process. But this is now the foremost leader of the biotech and bioscience industry in North Dakota, and it's really and it started when he was in college, and that company was formed. He basically had trouble raising money, so they used credit cards. And I would not recommend for our viewing listeners that this is but it worked for him, right? But it is, and so he used his credit cards until he got going and got his first orders, and it has been just a wild success. And since we're talking about COVID, I think it's very important to know that there's 40 companies right now that are looking at a vaccine or therapies for COVID. Every one of them has ties. Every one of them has a tie to Aldevron. Now think about that.
Yeah.
So Fargo, the company from Fargo, is at the center of how we are going to solve the COVID problem. Now that's simply amazing. And there's like 9 companies now that are sort of in a race to get a vaccine, and of those 40, and and Aldevron is providing the platform for the science that they're using to get a vaccine.
Yeah.
And I couldn't give you a current head count, but I think they're like 400 employees right now, maybe on their way to 500. And they're on their way with their expansion when they open up their new buildings. They're on their way to 1,000 employees. Wow. And now that is just a wonderful thing.
Tell us about the UND Center for Innovation.
I started it in 1984 with the idea in mind that I hadn't really noticed that the major employers in North Dakota really are not branch offices from elsewhere, but people who really started companies here, whether that be on Main Street or manufacturing companies and everything else. And I really saw a real need for people to learn the skills of starting and growing a company. And what I did, it was the 4th entrepreneur outreach center in the nation. And I wanted it around innovation. So the first name was the Center for Innovation and Business Development. And business development was the word we used that time at entrepreneurship, which wasn't quite in vogue yet. But by 5-6 years later, it was. So I wish I would have had that trend before. I should have had the Center for Innovation and Entrepreneurship. But the Center focused on that, and then we added angel capital as a major focus as a part of that, which is the mother's milk of growth for innovative companies. And so it was a terrific one. And by the time I retired in 2017, we had received 18 national and international awards for excellence. And we were featured as one of the 6 most important venture development organizations in the United States, helping start and grow companies. So that was terrific. So it was a great run. I loved it, and what I really loved was the people. Yeah. I love entrepreneurs.
Yep. Lastly, if people want your book, you and Hiram's book, where can they find it?
They can find it online at dakotabooknet.com. So it's booknet.com, dakotabooknet.com, or you can find it in some of the regional bookstores.
Okay.
I am now working to see what we can do to get it also into the state historical bookstores, because it's history of North Dakota.
Okay. Thanks, Bruce, for being here.
Glad to be here.
Stay tuned for more.
Using his master's in geology and nearly 50 years of experience throwing pottery, Jim Ulmer has found the perfect intersection between science and art. In his studio near Frazee, Minnesota, Jim makes beautiful stoneware pottery that is made to use.
I've been making pots for 48 years. I started at UND years ago. When I got my master's degree in geology, I started throwing pots then. What's interesting about the geology and pottery connection is that it's both science. What I do is I make rocks. In that whole process of the clay itself, I know all about the clay and I know all about the minerals that go into the glazes that I make and how they melt and how they affect each other. And that whole process is science, as well as then the art aspect of it, of throwing, and you're visualizing what you want to make and you do it. What you see when I throw a pot is a reflection of that 48 years of throwing. I make stoneware pottery, and it's designed to be used in everyday situations. And the way I glaze and fire, everything's very safe to use. It's very hard. It can go into dishwashers. And I make a huge variety of things, plates, mugs, really large pots that are more decorative, you might say. I throw all kinds of bowls. It's one of my favorite things to throw, all different sizes. I like to do sets where they can all nest within each other, because I think that that's a nice way of storing them. And so I think about size and shape of all the things, but mostly what I make is pieces to serve with. When I'm throwing, it's the same process all the time. Well, first of all, you have to have the idea. Same amount of clay, two different forms. I usually know what basic clay I'm going to make. The clay itself is a really important factor, and I use what they call stoneware clay. And stoneware clay is a blend of clays from all over different parts of the United States that are blended together so that you can use it easily in your hands. It's not too hard, it's not too soft. And then I wedge it up, or I knead it before I use it, so it makes sure that it's all blended together nicely before I throw. If you don't think about it, you'll put it right in the center. You throw the ball of clay onto the wheel, centering it. Centering is the most important thing. If not, when it's spinning around, the pot's going to be wobbling and you can't work with it. After that, you open it up, and when you pull it up to the top, if it's not in center, part of the lip will be taller than the other because it's not in center. So you're always centering. Just a little bit of water, and you want to leave a nice ring of clay at the top. You want the lip of the pot to be nice and firm, like these right here. They're nice. So those processes are in my mind every time I make a pot. But sometimes in the throwing process, the clay speaks to you, and you can either go with it or not. The better that you get at making pots, the more you can control every aspect of it. All the glazes are very similar. Every time I pour them, you can't pour it exactly right, but they will be, unique to themselves. So if you have, let's say, a tendon or replace settings, I can make them all go together. And on big pots, when you pour the glaze on the pot, as it wraps itself around the glaze itself, all of a sudden it does something totally different, and I allow that to happen. And so every time when I open my kiln to look at them after firing it, it's always a very unique experience for me and for anyone else who happens to be there to look at it. I have built 5 kilns over the years, and I make what's called a car kiln, and that means that the floor and the door And all the pots and the shells and everything are on a track. And I can pull that out from the main body of the kiln when I open the kiln. It's always very exciting. It takes a month of throwing and glazing and preparing to fill up my kiln and then to fire it, which takes another 12 hours and 2 days to cool. So by the time ready to open it up and see the result of what I've done. You can tell when they're fired perfectly when they ring like that. And you know there's no cracks, there's nothing problem, the pot is perfect. What I try to do is have something in someone's house so that that's for their traditions. I look at it as from my hands to yours, you know, because it literally comes from my hands. I would say that it took me 10 years before I could actually throw what I thought. In those 10 years, there was always pots that were close to exactly what I wanted, but it took a while and a lot of practice so that I could think about a pot, sit down and throw it. It feels really good. I feel really lucky that I have found something, you know, that I can do, feel really good about it, that people appreciate it, and they have supported me all these years.
Well, that's all we have on Prairie Post this week. As always, thanks for watching.
Funded by the Minnesota Arts and Cultural Heritage Fund with money from the vote of the people of Minnesota on November 4th, 2008. And by the members of Prairie Public.